Chapter 17. Baker. I woke up a few hours later, Orion's arms around me, the world buzzing and beautiful, my heart so full I thought it would burst. He loved me, he'd said. So, and he was in my bed or his bed, whatever, but with me. His shirt creases had left an imprint in my cheek. I didn't care. I snuggled against him, slipping my fingers through his hair and tangling my legs in his. He was so warm, strong, solid, but he smelled strange, like dogs and old blood. I leaned up on my elbows so I could stare at him sleeping. He looked so beautiful, strong cheekbones and jaw, soft mouth, dark hair against his light skin, so beautiful. I needed to kiss him. I tried to resist because kissing a sleeping person might be weird, but he said he loved me and he'd been gone so long. I leaned closer and kissed him. I'd meant to barely brush his lips, but the feel of him, the rush of steady, exquisite energy, I couldn't resist it. Pressed my lips to his, tasted him, delving deeper and deeper, knowing that he would wake. But he didn't. I'd been kissing him for a while before I pulled away and stared down at him. He shouldn't have been able to sleep through that. Orion. I poked his chest, lifted his hand and let it flop down, then squished his cheeks. Nothing. I froze while my heart pounded. Was he dead? Maybe he'd turned into a vampire. No, his chest rose and fell steadily. Maybe he was just tired, really, really tired. Or maybe I'd sucked the life out of him and now he was going to die. I scrambled out of the bed and backed away towards the door. Orion, I whispered. I'm going to talk to Landry and bake you something. If I could bring him back from almost dead with Jello, I could save him from whatever this was. Right? Maybe. Hopefully. I turned and ran, taking the steps down the tower 3 at a time. He had to be well. He had to be okay. He would be. He'd be perfectly fine. He was just tired and it was catching up to him. Ran into Landry on the other side of the kitchen door. He turned and grabbed my arm, keeping me from sprawling. Hello. Have you seen Orion? He's in my bed, but he's not moving. He's not dead. What's wrong with him? Is he dead? He glanced at the clock. He got here around 5, right? Now it's 9:15, so the likelihood of him being in a coma from you is pretty small. Were you kissing that entire time? I shook my head. We did kiss, I admitted. But it was only for an hour or something. He stared at me. An hour of kissing? I shrugged helplessly. Is he going to be okay? He nodded slowly. I'll look into it. I'm sure he'll be fine. Butchers collapse at times during the days of darkness when they've been under too much strain. Orion's been pushing hard. Why don't you bake him something and I'll take up some supplements? I hesitated, then nodded. He'd take care of Orion. At the same time, I was responsible for him. What supplements will you use? He turned me and pushed me towards the kitchen. I'll tell you later. Why don't you make some cream puffs? He loves those. He left me alone in the kitchen, the long room with dark beams, herbs, and freshly killed animals hanging over the counters and ovens. It was all terribly wrong. I felt like I was going to throw up. I had to see Orion. I had to taste him again. I had to hold him and stare at him and feel his heart pound beneath my hand. I needed him, all of him, forever. I shook my head and started towards the flour bin in the corner, carried the entire thing to the table and worked on bread, muffins, cream puffs, and strudel at the same time, with chocolate pudding that I ate from the pan like I knew I wasn't supposed to do. I didn't care. Everything was a mess of not caring, because what I needed to do was go upstairs and wrap myself around Orion until everything was okay. After 45 minutes of haphazard baking, the kitchen door crashed open. Orion stalked towards me, his eyes dark and glittering. I reached for him, my hands in the silken strands of his hair, when he turned his head and sank his teeth into my forearm. For a moment there was a flash of pain, but then there was energy, so much energy and connection beneath the skin, his teeth, tongue, breath filling my veins with pure, unadulterated life. I was flooded with so many sensations as every nerve in my body exploded in pleasure. My legs gave out as his teeth sank deeper, and I felt more of him than I'd thought possible. We both sank onto the floor and maybe would have stayed there floating on clouds of bliss forever if the alarm hadn't gone off. I blinked at him, his face blurry but still beautiful, attached to my arm like he was part of me. It beeped again, but I'd lost my ability to understand anything besides him. Someone ripped me away from him and knocked Orion back with the edge of a cast iron skillet. The agony of being away from Orion hurt so much more than the distant throbbing in my arm. My eyes wouldn't focus, but the beeping rang in my head on and on. Something was burning. Oh, cream puffs. I pulled myself to my feet, using the leg of the table until I could stumble to the oven. I burned myself, taking them out, but it only hurt a little bit. Armand grabbed my arm, his touch painful, raw and harsh over my bite. He dragged me to the sink and ran cold water over my hand while I tried to stay on my feet. I looked over at Orion where he sat on the floor glaring at Armand, his expression so hard and alien I didn't know him. Orion. He changed his gaze to me, and it was so dark, so heavy, so sweet and aching. I stepped towards him, or I tried to, but Armand pulled me back with a jerk, holding a knife at my throat. Feed him, Vanilla. Feed him or I'll gobble you up myself. That didn't make any sense, but metal against my neck, Armand at my back, and Orion staring at me, and Armand like he was about to pounce at any moment, ripping the world apart to get to me, and maybe rip me on accident made me pick up a knife and cut open the cream puffs. I spooned in chocolate pudding until the plate was ready. Armand slid it over the table towards Orion, who ate without taking his eyes off me. I watched him eat, aching for his lips on me, his teeth to bite into my skin, to feel him so deep and consuming. But after he'd had half the pan, his eyes changed, and instead of the raw mindless desire and destruction, shock, horror, and guilt echoed back at me. I bit you. He stumbled back a step, but he took the cream puffs with him. That made me smile. The cream puffs are terrible. The filling is generic chocolate pudding. He looked down at the cream puffs, ate another one with his eyes closed, and shook his head. Nothing short of miraculous. He opened his eyes and gazed at me with so much tenderness my soul trembled. Nothing from your hands could possibly be anything less. He ate two more and then ran a shaky hand over his chin over red streaks. I looked down at my arm where Armand still had a grip. He still had a knife at my throat. Come to think of it, I shifted away from him. Can you put down the knife and let me clean out my cut, Armand? What are you doing here anyway? He growled low and my skin prickled while he sniffed me, my neck and bare shoulder around my camisole straps. It's not a cut, it's a bite. He dragged me back to the sink and let go of my arm, putting it under the water. He moved, quickly scrubbing out my wound before retrieving powders and bandages. He glanced up at Orion every now and then to make certain he kept his distance. Finally I was all bandaged and the bite still didn't hurt, not when Armand wasn't poking it. Tingled more than anything. Landry! Armand roared, the sound making me flinch and Orion scowl, but soon enough Landry came in, the CM behind him. Armand gestured at Orion. CMU can take him to your office for his report. Landry, you can take this cream puff before she faints on me. I half expected him to shove me in Landry's direction, but Armand stayed close to me until Orion showed signs of backing off. Landry came in, giving Orion a wide berth until Orion gave me an intense look. Violetta, I'll see you soon. I nodded and beamed at him. I'll be baking. We stared at each other, his eyes like magnets holding my gaze until the door closed, leaving me jarringly with Armand and Landry. I took a step away from Armand and my legs gave out. Armand grabbed my shoulders, not exactly the most comfortable position, as he dragged me to the ragged wingback chair. How badly did he bite her? Landry asked, looking from my mess of haphazard baking to my bandaged forearm. Meaty part of her arm, and she doesn't seem to be in any kind of pain. All the same, he bit hard through skin, muscle, possibly to the bone. I treated it with the usual powders. Landry nodded and then started rolling my bread dough into loaves. I tried to stand up to protest him messing with my baking, but I couldn't. I put a hand on my head because I was so dizzy and everything was still so achingly beautiful. Orion. I needed him. He's in trouble, Armand ground out. He's not allowed to bite the baker. Every good little butcher knows that. I shifted and pulled my legs up to curl in the chair. It didn't hurt. I don't want him to worry. He was worried that he'd hurt me, but it didn't hurt at all. Landry snorted and Armand looked disgusted, but I didn't care about them. Just wanted Orion. I sat in the chair aching, buzzing, floating, and eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, Orion sat across from me on the bench, carving a piece of wood into an intricate tree. I sighed happily because he looked up and was real, here, and so achingly beautiful. Had he really said he loved me? Seemed like a dream. We should talk, he said, his mouth in a firm line. About you biting me, or me putting you in a coma? His eyebrow twitched. Both either. That can't happen again. I agree. You were completely unresponsive. He frowned sternly. I wasn't in any real danger, but I hurt you. I looked down at the bandage, ran my fingers lightly over his bite, and he was. Right, it hurt. What do you think would have happened if Armand didn't come? Armand left. I hadn't even realized he was still in the kitchen, but he was. Stirring mushrooms and garlic on the stove. You'd bleed to death, but first. You drain him to nothing but dust. You two made a very pretty picture. Passed out on the floor. We weren't passed out, I said, but I couldn't really remember. I touched my bandage again. Didn't hurt that time. Felt a little bit like Orion, like I was deeply connected to him. Orion, can you hold me? He swallowed and I could see the struggle on his face. Armand doesn't want to. Clean another bite wound. No, Armand doesn't, Armand agreed, slamming a plate onto the table. I made omelets. Vanilla, you need to eat before you faint again. He handed me the plate and I took it, frowning at it because there wasn't any way that Armand could make something actually appetizing, except apparently he made a mean omelet. I ate, smiling when Armand handed another plate to Orion, then took another and drew up a chair so we were all sitting there eating eggs and planning to take over the world. That can't happen again, Armand said before biting his lovely mushrooms. Really good. What do you think caused it? I asked, studying Orion. He looked perfectly healthy. He seemed well rested and his eyes shone beautifully. Whatever that had been didn't seem to have affected him negatively. You said that if you bit me, you'd be shocked and stop. Orion cleared his throat. Apparently I had no idea what I was talking about. I've never actually bitten a baker before. I smiled slightly. It's a good thing, otherwise I'd be jealous. Seriously. That can't happen again. I thought I killed you. How long were you asleep? How did Landry wake you up? Orion shook his head. He didn't. I woke up without you and came to find you. Landry went to consult with the CM instead of directly looking after Orion. Armand put in helpfully. The CM wasn't entirely happy about that. I think Landry might be in trouble. He sounded like that was shocking. Why wouldn't Landry take care of you, Orion? Orion frowned. It's actually probably a good thing I didn't feel like he was. Between me and you, I may have hurt him. Bit him. Orion smiled, slow and very sexy. No, Violetta. I swear that I will never bite another baker. Armand grunted. You're supposed to swear that you'll never bite her either. Can't believe that Landry was so negligent. Orion shrugged. I was fine. I think that bakers have to be with butchers for days for anything really tragic to happen. I swallowed down the last bite of egg that suddenly didn't want to stay down. You mean that bakers have actually killed butchers? Dead. Orion shrugged like it wasn't very interesting. Not often. It's all about balance, Armand put in helpfully. I stood up and for a moment had a head rush until things got less dizzy. Why? Am I so dizzy after taking so much energy? I should be strong and focused, ready to bake a mountain of muffins. Orion smiled, but he held onto his fork tightly instead of reaching for me. Wanted him to take me in his arms and carry me off somewhere or nowhere. Here was good, except Armand would probably hit him with a cast iron skillet. Again. Too much connection, Orion said, his smile growing. Too much energy at one time can make you sick. I have a lot of energy to do that to you. Armand punched his shoulder hard so the sound of impact made a solid thudding noise. I reached out to touch his shoulder to rub it better, but Armand grabbed my wrist and pushed me back. The two of you are still completely unbalanced. Violetta, you should go for a walk. Yes, a long walk with me while Orion does something responsible like check on his boys. He took my plate, gave his and mine to Orion and dragged me past Orion, his hand still on my wrist. I brushed against Orion, and in that small contact so much of the feelings, the beautiful wonderful bliss swept through me that I didn't protest as Armand dragged me to the door, put Landry's coat on me and pushed me out wearing a pair of house slippers. I walked dizzy in the gloomy afternoon. I must have slept most of the day in the chair. After half an hour walking around the grounds of Candlestick, I shook my head and felt drops of water slide down the back of my neck. Took that long to realize it was raining. I stopped walking and whirled around to stare at Armand, my heart pounding. He stared back, face expressionless. Armand, did all of that really happen? He grunted and walked past me. I grabbed his arm, the fabric of his shirt damp but not cold. He was still warm in spite of the icy rain. If I could have killed Orion, why would Landry ever have allowed that? Why would the CM? Orion's so valuable to them. I know. I cured a couple of werewolves, but this risk seems really high compared to the benefits. Not that I didn't enjoy that whole thing, but I am not that kind of person, an escapist. I face my problems and deal with life. I don't do drugs or try and minimize the pain of existence in any other way. He laughed short, rough. No? You put on your brother's identity, and that's not an escape from yourself. You're an escapist just like everyone else. Your ways are just a little more elaborate and thorough than most. I scowled at him, my brother's scowl that maybe wasn't only his. I don't have to explain myself to you. I was doing it for my brother. He turned his head and looked at me, his eyes strange but beautiful beneath his tawny mane. I'm not judging you. I escaped this whole life and now I can't help but keep coming back to it. You want to lose yourself in the butcher the way he wants to drown in you. It's normal, love's a drug and all that good stuff. Denial never helped anyone. I'm not in denial. I don't want a love that completely eclipses everything else in my life. He only laughed. Whatever you say, Vanilla. Why do you keep calling me Vanilla? It's annoying. I'll have to call you Armed. No, that's not inane enough. Addled. Yes, that would be perfect. He laughed again. You're welcome to call me anything you like, Baker. You seem to be getting your mind back. I'll leave you then. I grabbed his shirt. Wait. You can't leave me. He raised an eyebrow and cocked his head. He had a line across his cheek, red like a scar. What? Just getting warmed up with the insults? I'd stay it so. Amusing to hear you try to insult me, but I have things to do. He took my hand and yanked it off his shirt, shaking his head. Things to do, Vanilla. Can't babysit you and Orion all the time. He turned and loped off. I tried to keep up with him for a little while, but house slippers did not work on the slick grass, and he was fast, very, very fast, disappearing into the dark woods around Candlestick and leaving me panting. I turned back to the house, the gray slate roof of the manor visible. However far I wandered, I walked back slowly, shivering, afraid that when I got to the kitchen my brain would melt at the first sight of Orion and I'd fall into his arms and not come out until someone hit Orion with a skillet. Again. When I got to the kitchen's back door, the rain was coming down hard. Shivered as I opened the door, staring inside to find Landry stirring an enormous pot of stew, bread and rolls rising on shelves that weren't filled with already baked goods. It felt safe and right even without Orion sitting on a bench waiting for me. He's gone to Calder. How are you feeling? I took off the big wool coat and hung it on the hook, then kicked off the sodden slippers before walking over the cold stone floor to the wood stove, where the wingback chair waited. I sniffed. I think I walked around in the rain with Armand too long, but other than that I'm fine. I stared into the fire, pulling my knees up and leaning over them to stare at the flickering flames. Landry, why didn't anyone tell me this would be so dangerous for Orion, us being together? It doesn't make sense to put him at risk. He glanced at me with a tight smile. No? To tell you the truth, when Orion told me that he was kissing a baker, I wasn't too happy about it, but your connection is strong because of that emotional and physical bond, and both of you are here where we can watch to make sure nothing too dire happens. Life is dangerous for butchers, Violetta. He shrugged. Life's dangerous for everyone, come to think of it. Death's coming for everyone. That's comforting. He stopped stirring his stew and went to the cupboard on the side of the enormous sink where he kept the tablets for Orion. He took out a bottle I remembered and I stuck out my tongue for the drops without him telling me. Made a face at the terrible taste, but then Landry handed me an apple popover. You're going to have to teach me how to make these, I said after I'd eaten half of it. So delicious. You haven't taught me very much since I've been here. He raised an eyebrow. Is that a complaint, Miss Tansetta? You're finessing your instincts. I haven't been finessing anything. The last batch I made was terrible. He laughed. There was more potency in one batch of those terrible loaves than a dozen of your ordinary kind. As for your cream puffs, it's a mystery since Orion consumed them all, but how well he's recovered without the slightest negative affects are a compliment to your baking. Maybe you don't have proper technique down quite yet, but you definitely aren't terrible. You're going to Have to rest and recover before you do any more baking. Why don't you go see the CM? Orion will come in the morning. I sighed and got up, still feeling completely off. At least my brain belonged to me. That was something. I rubbed my arm absently. It didn't hurt but sent a wave of tingling happiness through me. I jerked my hand away like I'd been stung. I did not need tingling happiness. I headed to the CM's office, still in my pajamas, shuffling along like an old man. Or an old woman. Whatever. A butcher was leaning against the wall outside the CM's office. I stared at him. He winked back. It was Casper, the young butcher who liked to flirt with me. "Hello, Miss Baker," he said with an eyebrow wiggle like there was something suggestive about that. "Butcher. Is the CM busy?" He shrugged. "Isn't he always? Are you waiting for him?" He shrugged again, but his smile was wild and dangerous. "Why, did you have an idea of how I could pass the time?" I scowled at him. Enough of this nice guy business. I stepped up, rapped quickly on the door and then backed away, but the door opened immediately and Sebastian, my brother, came out, his massive frame still too big for me to believe. He was bigger than Orion. How did that happen? "Hey Vi, what's going on? Are you in your pajamas? Are you sick or something?" He stepped forward and put his hand on my forehead. I brushed it away and stepped around him. "CM, do you have a minute? If Casper needed to talk to you first." Casper gestured me ahead of him. "Ladies first." Sebastian scowled at him. "Who are you calling a lady?" I rolled my eyes and headed past my idiot brother and into the CM's office, where I slumped into a chair without waiting for him to offer it to me. He closed the door and sat in the chair next to me instead of behind the enormous oak desk. "Can I get you some chocolate?" I perked up slightly. "Yes, I'd like that. I mean, Orion usually gets me chocolate, but I'm not sure." I slumped back down. He laughed, low and gentle, while he got up and put on a pot of coffee, except it was chocolate instead of coffee. The scent quickly filled the room and I relaxed slightly just smelling that delicious steam. "How are you feeling?" the Sim asked, sitting down in the brown leather chair beside me again. "Tired, achy, like I'm getting over the flu, or maybe about to have one. I don't know. I was walking around in the rain for a long time while my brain came back. Have you ever been a baker? I mean, do you know anyone who's dated butcher bakers, and how did it work? Doesn't seem like it can work. I mean, if I don't put him in a coma, he'll make me bleed to death. How can a relationship between us work? It can't, but what else can I do? I have a baking compulsion. I get up in the middle of the night unable to sleep until I bake something. If I left, I'd still bake, but I wouldn't have any butcher to draw the strength out of, and then I'd feel like this only 50 times worse. And all the time." He nodded as he listened intently. "You could quit baking. If you could restrain yourself from all baking for a few years, the compulsion would fade in time." I stared at him. Resist the compulsion for years? I can't resist it for 2 days. He laughed. "I suppose you had better find balance with your butcher then." "Balance? What does that mean? How can there be balance when I completely lost my mind with Orion? Completely. I wouldn't have cared if he bit my nose off. Seriously, I've never felt like that before. I knew a butcher who married a baker. She took good care of him. All the same, he had bite scars all up and down his arms. He didn't seem to mind." I winced. "No, I don't suppose he did. So a male baker married a female butcher, and they lived happily ever after minus a few comas and bite scars. They're still doing well. She's out west in the LA district. Their bond isn't as strong as yours and Orion's. By that I mean his baking wasn't ever as potently charged as yours, and of course Orion's the butcher, so his energy is more powerful than Sandy's." He shrugged. "The two of you seem to be doing well. I would have expected Orion to attack Armand for touching you while he was mindless, but he had sense enough to allow Armand to stop the bleeding." "Yeah, but I think that had something to do with the knife at my throat." He laughed, a beautiful sound, before he leaned forward, his eyes bright. "Really? Armand held you hostage? Clever. We're lucky he was waiting around to hear how many wolves were headed our way, and heard your baking alarm instead." I licked my lips. "I guess." He put a hand on my shoulder, my bare skin that Armand had sniffed so weirdly. "Do you want to practice taking my energy? You'll have to practice not taking Orion's." You'll get to the point where you'll be able to have control over those instincts while you sleep. That could come in handy one of these days. I frowned at him before I gingerly put my hand over his and let his energy sink into me. I didn't want his energy, not when I'd had so much perfect, exquisite Orion, but this wasn't about what I wanted. Whatever Armand thought. I did not run away when things got hard. I fought and I didn't give up. After a half hour trying to take his energy, I felt stronger but more irritable. The chocolate helped with the irritability. It wasn't the CM's fault that he wasn't Orion. Not that knowing that helped. I didn't know anything. It still didn't make sense that no one would even try to stop us from being together. CM, what happened at the warehouse by the docks? He raised his eyebrow. Did you know about that? We found several renegades. Your brother's friend, Anthony, one of them. Your brother insisted that he had quit fighting our cause, but apparently not. Where is he? I asked, standing up. He smiled slightly. He's being held, questioned, waiting his trial. Trial? His smile tightened. His position is very serious. His whole family could possibly become outcasts while he is executed, imprisoned, or exiled. I inhaled sharply. Anthony? He was the first one who ever gave me energy. Not a lot, and he teased me, but he was a friend. Why would he choose the rebels over Orion? Why would he ever choose a side that was fighting against everything he was? It made no sense. Why? Why did my dad pay money so the rebels could buy the warehouse? Why did they get killed? Why didn't Orion warn me that I could accidentally suck the life out of him? I swallowed and forced a smile. I understand. I'm going to visit my aunt and uncle this evening. He stood and nodded. Excellent. The Vespettis are wonderful people. May I drive you? I stared at him. I wouldn't want to bother you. I was going to call a cab. He laughed and shook his head. I don't think anyone would be happy with that idea. It's no bother, I assure you. I've been meaning to visit the Vespettis for some time. Why don't you get dressed and I'll tie up a few loose ends then? Meet you in the garage. I nodded because my head was running around in circles that didn't make sense. I needed to find out everything I could about my dad, the butchers, and I wasn't going to do that by baking Orion cream puffs. Chapter 18. Butcher. How are you? I glanced at Francis, then away. How was I? Such an excellent question. My heart still pounded twice as quickly as it should. Butcher's hearts beat slow. As a rule, until hunger increased heart rate to dangerous levels. I needed Violetta so desperately. I'd never lost it like that, not when slaughtering shadows. I hadn't expected to feel that way about a girl I'd woken up without her and had never moved so fast. I'd followed her scent in the air, seen her in the kitchen, and bit into her skin without the slightest thought one way or another. It was inevitable. There wasn't anything else in the world besides her skin between my teeth, and then the connection, the feel of her through my teeth, bones sinking so deep into me that I forgot we were separate entities. I took a deep breath, still shaky. I needed her to take my energy, but Landry insisted not until tomorrow. Insisted with a cleaver. How am I usually? Francis slung an arm over my shoulder. Did I usually let him do that? Couldn't remember. Felt strange, but everything felt upside down and inside out. Wrong without her. Well, you spent a week not killing werewolves and vampires. That can't have been fun. Don't worry. Tonight we'll all go out and satisfy your appetite for a clean, sweet death of the dark, decomposing evil. Some of them choose order, but why would they do that if their nature were evil? Perhaps it's humanity, the remains of a soul that still struggle ever on into the encroaching shadows. He stared at me and coughed. Yeah, probably something like that. So did you hear about the pack leader's attack of the warehouse? That was awesome. You missed a really good time. We captured 24 renegades. Anthony, one of them. Sebastian's kind of upset about it. He's kind of homicidal, actually. We had to restrain him to keep him from attacking Anthony. Kept saying he knew better, but Anthony just said he did it for Sebastian, which nobody got, but it made Sebastian even crazier. Anthony? Where is he? What cell? 32. I nodded and turned abruptly. I walked through the halls of Calder, nodding to everyone who met my eyes. They looked impressed, like it took some kind of skill to not kill werewolves and vampires indiscriminately. I suppose they were right. I headed down the stairs, past the black box, down another 2 levels, and past a crouching senior butcher who guarded this hall. He nodded to me. Butcher. I'm here to see 32. Is he resistant? He raised his eyebrows. That one? He's not going to give you anything useful. Got a serious attitude problem. He sits and kicks the door over and over and over. I'm going to get a werewolf to bite his foot off. I smiled at that image and slapped his shoulder. Hang in there. I've been dealing with this one for 4 years. I think I've got him figured out by now. I followed him to the door, letting him unlock it for me even though I had the keys. The door sprang open and out came Anthony. I punched him in the throat, knocking him back into the room. I followed him in, closing the door behind me. I walked over to the table and sat down. Seeing his tray of food, I started eating. It had been a while. Anthony gasped on the ground, hands to his throat while he sputtered and tried to breathe. This is good. Are those pecans? I had no idea you liked Thai. That makes you almost interesting. Still a renegade, Tony? That's so consistent of you. Loyal, upright, all things I thought you were allergic to. He stumbled to his feet and came at me swinging. I stood and swept the chair around, pinning him to the wall behind it. Orion, you pathetic, vicious butcher without a conscience. You're going to fail. You're going to die and your body will be dragged through the streets for everyone to spit on. I nodded and stepped back, releasing him from the wall. I really appreciate your confidence in me. I kicked his leg out from under him when he tried to kick me and put the chair down on his wrists and sat, leaning over to get the tray. Do you think I'm heavy? It's the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I pressed down and he gritted his teeth, trying to get up to get me off him. The butchers are over. The world is changing, ending, and nothing is going to stop it. I nodded while I took a bite of really great rice noodles. Did you try these? Really great. I wonder what baker did these. They're drugged. All your prisoners are drugged. I studied the tray for a minute before I shrugged and took another bite. It's too late for me. May as well finish it. Have you been skipping meals? That's so sensible of you to be so suspicious of your captors. Weaken yourself once. You're already in our power. I pulled a roll from laundry out of my pocket. I do know that we don't provide imprisoned butchers with baked goods. There's no sense wasting it on someone who isn't going to be fighting the darkness. Right. I held it above his mouth and watched his eyes widen and mouth water. He hadn't had quality baked goods for some time. Do you know how much I love baked goods? It's the best part of being a butcher, don't you agree? That crisp and flaky crust, the soft and moist interior, all perfectly created for a butcher who fights against the darkness and never fails. Without the baked goods, what are we? Renegades, pretenders, but not butchers. He was quiet for a minute and I saw something in his eyes that surprised me. Fear. But not afraid for himself but someone else. Oh, this was something. Why did you betray Sebastian? He thinks of you as his brother. He's quite devastated to hear that he's going to be the one who decides your fate. He stared at me, his eyes wide and the fear in them brighter. I would bet my coat that he'd gone back to the renegades in some futile effort to save Sebastian. How to get him to confess. Why would you do that? He whispered. I shrugged. I'm evil. Isn't that what you said? The question is why you went back to the renegades. You've already tried them out, and it's not like you to be so constant, at least not about anything other than Sebastian. The two of you have been friends for a very long time. His lips curved and I knew he was going to say something that would make me kill him. I've known Violetta for a long time too. Her mom let her hug me, take my energy and bake for Sebastian. There's nothing like feeling a baker's soft body against yours while you feel the rush of her need. I frowned at him. I didn't realize you knew Violetta. She's going to be disappointed in you. His eyes widened. His words were calculated to infuriate me, but if I could cope with the idea of Armand giving my Violetta energy at the risk of him biting her, I could handle Tony's long-ago memory. I did want to beat in his face, but that was normal, a perfectly healthy reaction to dealing with Anthony. You don't know anything about Vi. You think you know her because you managed to get her into your bed and who knows what you're doing with her, but I've known her for years. She's better than you. She deserves to be safe far away from this world. I nodded. I agree that I don't deserve her, but I'm determined to keep her safe. How can you do that? She's gone up against something you don't even understand. He's going to take her in. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Very interesting. The blood in my veins went cold. It was a peculiar sensation I'd never had before, like my heart turned into a block of ice at the idea of the monster who had decimated werewolf villages taking Violetta. I forced myself to stay calm. He was the one who would be manipulated into having emotional reactions. She's perfectly safe, I said with a dismissive wave of my hand. We have everything under control. He laughed, sounding hysterical. Of course the great Orion Daughtry couldn't possibly be completely out of control. As long as I worked with them, Violetta and Sebastian were safe. Now he's going to take her. He's not going to kill her, he's going to keep her. My jaw ached from clenching it so hard. Do you think you can trust a monster like that? He snarled back at me, a lunge that almost knocked me and my chair off him. Do you think I should trust you? If he can get to Mal, he can get to anyone. Who do you trust that's going to betray you next? I got up and put the chair back by the table.
I'm listening.
He sat up and ran his hands through his ragged hair. It had been cut by knives. It looked like he was in really bad shape. Whether he knew it or not, he'd been a prisoner for some time. I tossed him the roll and he caught it, ripping into it before he thought about who was giving it to him. He was completely out of his mind with fear. I couldn't blame him, not if he'd been held captive by the monster who'd eaten werewolves. Who knew what he'd seen and who knew how much of that he remembered? I pulled a chocolate cream puff from my special inside pocket and stared at it. For a long time, my mouth watering. I put it on the edge of the table and had to step back when he came up with a punch. I dodged, grabbed his wrist and pulled it behind his back, holding his face down inches from the cream puff. That is Violetta's baking. Can you smell it? The power she bakes is nothing short of miraculous. Most butchers won't ever taste anything like that their whole lives. I will, if you tell me everything you know, let you have it. He struggled a little bit and I tightened my grip on his wrist, pulling his arm back so it bowed dangerously. I could snap his arm, but that wouldn't be as much fun as getting to the bottom of this mess. At least I told myself that giving up Violetta's last cream puff was a true sacrifice on my part. She'd thrown so much energy into those that it was amazing I didn't have a heart attack. What do you want to know? That you've betrayed everything when you let your brother go free instead of killing him for the murder of an innocent butcher. Or that the butchers did nothing for Sebastian when he was dying, wasting away. Sicker every day, every moment, nothing? A monster had to save him. He took us in when we knew nothing, taught us how to take care of ourselves when all you saw were two losers who weren't good enough for your butchers. You'll all fall and it will be too late. Sebastian's going to fall. The monster's going to rip Sebastian apart and take Violetta for his own baker. What will taking his energy do to her? I licked my lips. Good question. What do you think it would do to someone as sweet and delicate as Violetta? He twisted, but I only tightened my grip and pressed his head against the table. You need to send her away before he gets his hands on her. What he did to the other bakers. He shuddered and jerked, out of control of his body. I spun him around, crammed the cream puff in his mouth and watched as he went through various stages of shock, then writhed on the floor screaming. I stood there watching him, feeling heavier and heavier until the door opened, and the guard came in. He came beside me and shook his head before he turned and left me alone again. This was what a vampire could do to you if it got into your head, your blood. I couldn't do anything. I turned and left, telling the guard to call the CM as I passed him. From the bits he'd given me, it was pretty clear that Sebastian owed his miraculous healing to the monster, or at least Anthony thought so. Needed to kill something, but first I had paperwork to do. I needed to talk to Armand about the warehouses, about all of this. I needed to know what happened that night. Was Lance behind this monster, or was there another butcher we didn't know about that was getting vengeance for Lance? The threat to Violetta was very real, but what else could I do to protect her? She was in Candlestick, sleeping safely in my tower where no one could get to her besides Landry. Couldn't I trust my father's baker? If I couldn't, who could I trust? I couldn't even trust myself, not with Violetta. I should send her away somewhere, but she wasn't mine to send. How could I possibly live without her? I could barely walk in the direction away from her, even knowing I would see her tomorrow. I needed to see her, hold her, make certain that she was safe. Everything else was secondary to that. She was everything. Orion, how's it going? I just got back from the CM. Violetta looks sick. Is she okay? I clenched my fists but smiled at Sebastian. I'm sure she'll be fine. I'm sorry about Tony. He froze and his eyes went wild and angry. I'm ashamed to have called him my friend. I shook my head. He's under the influence of a powerful force. I wouldn't hold it against him. He thinks that he's protecting you. You should execute him. His voice was as cold and harsh as his eyes. He looked like a butcher. I don't need to. Right now he's writhing on the floor. He'll be dead or a vegetable before much longer. He gritted his teeth, his pale green eyes bright and angry. Then there isn't anything else to talk about. What do you need me for, Orion? He sounded so old, so commanding, like he was demanding that I give him orders. Paperwork, I said with a wry smile. I didn't want to smile, not when his friend was suffering, and he wasn't letting himself feel anything human about it, but butchers weren't allowed to feel. I studied everything about the seals that I could get my hands on while Sebastian dealt with organizing the troops for the next week's attacks. He scratched notes intently like it wasn't the most boring thing in the world to analyze data and organize troops. Had I been like that once? He'd probably love going to meetings, listening to the more experienced butchers weigh in on important topics. Maybe it was time for me to retire. Maybe I needed to take Violetta somewhere far away where darkness couldn't ever touch her. But I could. I had difficulty focusing. I needed to see Violetta, but I also needed to go out and slaughter something. Everything. Finally it was time to go out into the night, Sebastian at my side. He strode ahead, long coat swirling around his legs, munching on a Landry biscuit. Followed him, half amused, half curious where he'd take me. When he realized that I was watching him, that he was leading the way, he stammered and fell back. Sorry, Butcher. I thought you'd like to know where the action is likely to be tonight. Lead on, Butcher's boy. I haven't worked the streets in ages. He snorted and broke into a jog, clearly eager to engage with the shadows. He wasn't the only one. We headed northeast, cutting towards the river. There was a warren of buildings with narrow alleys between, the scent of cigarettes, cheap beer and vomit in the air. A werewolf flew out of the shadows, knocking Sebastian back, or it would have, but Sebastian had his knife out, cutting it and tossing it to the side like he'd barely noticed it. The wolf had gone for him instead of me, seeing him as the greater threat. Werewolves weren't usually wrong about danger. Sebastian moved with greater confidence, filling the shadows with his bright strength and perfect faith. He would hold back the darkness single-handedly if he had to. He had no doubt, no fear or weakness, only hunger. I followed him, taking the leftovers while the real danger focused on him. Zombies, vampires, race all attacking him as though I didn't exist. Odd. I dropped back and let Sebastian cut through evil on his own while I turned and headed in another direction. I slipped through the shadows, unnoticed by the shuffling zombies or the slinking outlaw wolves. I didn't kill, only followed the slightly off tinge in the air. I ducked through a low cement doorway without a door, heading deep inside a maze of corridors full of werewolf droppings and zombie detritus. I continued until I reached a small room that wasn't more than a pass-through, but there was a human corpse slumped near the wall. He had to be dead with how bad he stank, but what human body wouldn't get consumed by the monsters? I walked over, pressing myself against the wall as a zombie shuffled through, moaning as he scraped the wall, trying to stay away from the corpse. As soon as it was gone, I dropped down beside the man, turning him over to reveal his face. I knew that face, knew the enormous forearms and girth of him. Had anyone known the baker was missing? Had he recently retired? There was something in one of my reports about a baker retirement party. I picked him up over my shoulder, the stench capable of knocking an ordinary man out. I only staggered into the wall where the zombie had left a nice smear of gore. I shifted him and continued on. The baker was a certifiable monster. Repellent. I grunted as I traced my path back out of the maze. I didn't get lost, only took the wrong turn intentionally 3 times. Finally I ducked back out beneath the low cement doorway. My back screamed, but I ignored it. The baker was not light, and he didn't smell so great, and I was getting nauseous as well as hungry. Bakers were protected in our district. They were sacred. If someone had taken this baker and abandoned him here, what could happen to Violetta? I love you, I whispered. The dead baker didn't respond in my own stomach. was roiling so violently, I had to drop him and heave in a corner for a few minutes. When was the last time I'd had a reaction like that? Couldn't remember if I'd ever shown that kind of revulsion. I leaned against the wall, panting and trying not to notice the dead baker. Violetta was in danger, and I couldn't do anything about it. I shuddered violently and threw up again until I felt empty, my heart a block of ice that spread through the rest of my body. I straightened up, scooped up the body and threw him over my shoulder before I marched steadily out of the maze. I made it back to my car before I lowered the body, opened the trunk and arranged the wool blanket that had held Violetta, and now held a dead baker. My hands shook so hard the blanket slipped. I smoothed it out, retrieved the body and laid it carefully in the trunk, hesitating for a moment as I stared into those vacant eyes before I covered his face with the blanket. I closed the trunk and started back towards the darkness, a knife in my hand. That part of tonight's work done, I had a butcher's boy to find before he did something stupid. He could get stuck down there fighting for days once he attracted their attention. He could get overwhelmed by the hunger and be overrun without noticing. My knife shook as I stabbed in and sliced down the side of a wolf, flesh sizzling beneath my silver blade. Its eyes were surprised as though he hadn't seen me coming. Everything reacted like that, the enormous circle of monsters that surrounded Sebastian, who fought with undaunted enthusiasm in spite of the danger. I waded through bodies, slashing and ending lives with as little mess and effort as possible. I wasn't feeling well. Something was wrong with me. From my heart still feeling frozen and my hands shaking, but butchers didn't get sick. I shook it off and made quick work of the zombies, exploding bodies silently and dissolving race with a detachment I'd never felt before. Felt like I was drowning inside my body, the image of the baker wrapped in the wool blanket blinking in my mind's eye to Violetta's eyes staring up blankly, her body discolored and torn like his had been. Her perfect, beautiful body bitten her. I was out of control, the world was out of control, everything was spinning out of control. I dismembered a zombie, dissolved a trio of wraiths with a combination of acid and flame, but it didn't penetrate, didn't seem like the reality. Violetta, lying on the blanket, opening her eyes and screaming my name, body convulsing as Anthony's had done, and me incapable of doing anything to save her. That seemed real. Butchers didn't save. We killed. No single life above the greater good. Self-control, self-discipline, self-sacrifice, but not only that. We had to sacrifice others, allow others to die for the cause. My heart constricted in my chest and I fell to my knees, agony flowing through me like ice was slashing through my veins, ripping them apart. Couldn't breathe, could only see Violetta's eyes, hear her scream die down to a whimper, and her eyes go glassy. No, I could protect her. I vaguely felt something slice through my back. I couldn't see through the tears that dripped from my eyes to the filthy pavement. Orion, what are you doing? Dying? No, if only that were the problem. I couldn't talk as my body dissolved into fear. I saw Violetta, her smile turning into terror. She screamed as I held her in my arms, her stomach distended with my child, a child that was ripping her apart, the butcher inside her, too much for her to bear. I held her as she died in my arms in childbirth, got to see her again, the agony in her eyes as she looked up from the body of that child wasted away, dead from the struggle to change from butcher. Another scene, I was holding her, euphoria changing to horror as I realized that she was unresponsive in my arms, her sweet face smiling as her blood drowned me. I watched her die 1,000 deaths, felt the agony of every disappointment, every possible betrayal. Everything faded in and out until I felt a rush of icy water on my face and sat up gasping. Armand wasn't scowling at me. Instead he looked curious while Sebastian behind him frowned in concern, and I took a deep shuddering breath before I rolled to my side and curled up in a shuddering ball, tears rolling down my face. Never cried before, had I? What's wrong with him? Sebastian whispered. Can you stop it? Is he poisoned? Armand growled. I told you, cub, he's had a vision. This is a mild reaction, considering he's a butcher who's never known fear. This is a compounding of all the times he should have felt fear and felt anticipation instead. This is what fear does to a man. He has no idea what to do with it. I spread my palm out, pressing it against the wood floor while I tried to get control. I took deep breaths, even and steady like my father had taught me. Hadn't seen the purpose before. As much as I hated wraiths, I hadn't been afraid of them. Now I was. What a wraith could do to Violetta, what one touch could do to her heart, her faith in me, I couldn't think about it, but I couldn't help it. Zombies sinking their teeth into her skin, vampires ripping her apart, or worse, sinking fangs into her, turning her until she became one of them and smiled at me, willing me to try and kill her. I couldn't. Never. I would gladly give my heart and soul to evil to be with her as a vampire, zombie, wraith, whatever form she took. I would always belong to her and follow her to the grave or wherever she went. Sebastian frowned, trying not to look at me. He would have died if his parents hadn't made a deal with a monster, found a way to save him, and lost their lives in his place. Violetta would do that. She would gladly lose her life for someone else. She had so much courage, so much strength, and here I was, leading her into a life where she would have to watch those she loved suffer and die. I knew that everything I'd seen wasn't real. The CM had visions from time to time that left him in his bed, sometimes for days, but he explained clearly that they were not visions of the future, but possibilities that he had to consider logically and rationally after the overwhelming emotions passed. How could I conquer this? If I continued to pursue Violetta, even if I didn't bite her lethally, I would give her children that she would have to watch helplessly suffer. I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't do that to me. It had always been stupid selfishness that I rationalized as a necessity. She needed a butcher's energy, so being with her, taking her baking and sweetness wasn't vile and despicable, but justified. I'd lied to myself because I'd wanted her. She needed someone more responsible, someone who would look after her best interests before his own. She needed someone who could protect her instead of trying to kill everything in the world as though that would keep her safe. She needed someone else, and I had to be strong enough to see that she got it. I could at least protect her from myself. Chapter 19. Baker. Sitting in the living room with my aunt and uncle and the CM was more than a little awkward. I only lasted 5 minutes before I made some excuse and headed into the kitchen to see Puffer. He was watching an old rerun quiz show in the corner of the kitchen while he peeled potatoes. He looked over and nodded at me like he'd expected me. Maybe he had. Would the CM call first? I should have. Why didn't I think of those things? I'd never felt entirely comfortable with my aunt and uncle, but Sebastian never had a problem with them. Puffer, do you know if any of my dad's stuff is here? He scratched his chin with the end of his peeler. Yeah, some of your parents' things were left here, boxes in the garage. Why don't you go out, check it? While the CM's entertaining your aunt and uncle. He got up and tucked his peeler into his white apron pocket, then led me out the kitchen door to the enormous garage, almost as big as the house. Inside it was empty besides a few cars, but there were stacks of boxes that looked out of place in the otherwise tidy space. Thanks, Puffer. I gave him a shaky smile. He nodded, then hesitated, gesturing towards my arm and its bandage. What happened to you? I hesitated, then shrugged. My butcher bit me. He raised his gray eyebrows. Did he now? If it starts hurting, let me know, and I'll put something on it. He turned and headed out, leaving me alone. Thanks, Puffer, I called. K-12. He raised his hand but didn't turn. I knelt down on the cement floor and went through the first box. It took me a long time to sort things. There were pictures and papers, school reports and letters from people I didn't know. Was sitting there, piles around me, sniffling as I stared at a picture of my parents beside the pool, her laughing, him looking serious, but I could see the smile in his eyes. He was such a butcher, serious but kind, like Orion. Had he ever bit my mother? Not anywhere I could see it. They'd been extremely happy together. Could I be like that with Orion? He wasn't a retired butcher. He was the butcher. Still, I'd never felt like that before, that good and complete and blissful. No, we couldn't let that happen again. Violetta, the CM would like to have a word with you. I looked up at my uncle, Vincent, but before I could get up, the CM came into the garage smiling calmly when he saw me sniffling over old photos. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to get back. Your uncle will bring you back when you're ready to return, or you can stay the night and return in the morning. I smiled. Thanks. You don't need to worry about me. He raised his eyebrows. I don't? That's not what your brother tells me, or anyone else for that matter. I can't think of anyone who thinks I shouldn't worry about you constantly. That sounds exhausting. He laughed. Not at all. I always worry about everything. That's my job. It sounds like a terrible job. He shook his head. There are benefits. Like what? He thought for a moment. I'm not sure, but there must be some. Have a good evening. He turned and left me shaking my head. He was almost funny sometimes. I went through box after box, but I didn't find anything to clue me in on why my parents would give money to some renegade leader who may or may not have been Olivia's brother, Lance. I did, however, find a folder labeled First Municipal Courthouse, and when I opened it, I stared at it for a long time before the words made any sense. Legal adoption for my father, Joseph Tancetta. Was he adopted? No, not at that date 18 years ago. Then I found our names, mine and my brother's. Violetta Cesario Tancetta. I read the papers over and over while my fingers felt numb. This wasn't what I was looking for. I didn't want to see that kind. A thing didn't need to. I stumbled to my feet, leaving the mess of papers in my wake. I walked out of the garage, along the well-lit path feeling numb and blank. It was too much. I walked into Puffer's kitchen and started baking, throwing things together. Without any idea what I was doing, not focusing on anything, and the resulting mess was so strange looking. I almost dumped the entire pan of odd-shaped biscuits into the garbage, but Puffer stopped me. I'll take those, Miss Tancetta. Why don't you go to bed? You've had a long day. Landry called, and he's making certain we'll be well guarded through the night. You're safe here. I stared at Puffer, at his bright blue eyes. Landry. His eyes were pale green, like my brother's eyes, like mine, and my mother had interned with him 19 years ago if she'd helped with Orion's conception. Landry, who was overprotective and strangely fatherly. Maybe not so strangely. Landry, who was the greatest baker ever, my birth father. I sat down on a kitchen chair and stared at my hands, my strong hands and sensibly short nails. I needed to see Orion. I couldn't go back to Candlestick Manor, not until I'd figured this whole thing out. My dad was my dad. He'd always been nothing besides the perfect father. Not that he didn't get cranky and short-tempered sometimes, but he was always my dad. I swallowed down thickness in my throat and took a deep breath. I stood up, smiled at Puffer, and headed to the guest bedroom. I unwrapped the blue men's pajamas and dressed, then lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. The last time I'd been there, I'd been idiotically giddy about my and Orion's first kiss. Now I had his first bite. I touched my arm, and for a moment the aching confusion vanished beneath a wash of perfect happiness, but it didn't last, and it shouldn't. I closed my eyes, determined to rest, but I spent a restless night, getting up around 4 a.m. and pulling out my phone. I needed to talk to Orion. I called him, curled up in the guest bed, listening to it ring. The voice that answered, instead of filling me with happiness and relief, put me on edge. Vanilla, what do you want? Armand, why do you have Orion's phone? At the moment I'm more fun, hard as that is to imagine. He's curled up in a fetal ball crying. That was impossible. Orion didn't cry or fear or anything like that. You're lying. He laughed, a short bark. It's his first vision. Those take it out of us. You should probably bake something particularly nice for him. What vision? Butchers have visions? Like of the future? No, butchers don't have visions. CMs have visions. You're saying that Orion is a CM? I thought a CM was in charge of a district with butchers under him. Armand, you're not making any sense. Am I supposed to? A CM is a CM with or without a district, like a butcher is a butcher with or without a district, or a CM. As for not having butchers, you should tell your brother that Orion's not his CM, because he acts like it. He's circling Orion like a puppy with its dead mother, and there's nothing to kill, so he hasn't got any distractions. It's very funny. That doesn't sound very funny. I have a sick sense of humor, he assured me. Look, Armand, are you serious about something being wrong with Orion? Yes, Vanilla. Oh, your brother would like to chat. Vi, where are you? What are you doing? You need to come bake for him. No. Armand, we shouldn't move him until he feels better. She should come here. What are you doing? Don't throw holy water on him. The phone clicked off and I was left to stare at the phone. I almost called back, but I wasn't sure if I could deal with Orion if he wasn't completely fine. I couldn't deal with Armand or my brother, not when I could barely deal with my own bones. I swung my legs out of bed and dressed quickly, calling a cab because I had to get back to Candlestick, but I wasn't going to wake anyone. I needn't have bothered. When I came downstairs, my Uncle Vincent was sitting in an armchair at the bottom of the stairs, reading a newspaper. He looked up and nodded. "I'll get the car. You can grab breakfast." He got up and walked out a side door that led to the garage while I stared at him. I sighed and called to cancel the cab. It was just as well. I had a lot of questions, but I wasn't sure if I had the stomach for the answers. I went into the kitchen and made some toast and eggs, then looked up to see my uncle in the doorway, his neat slacks and button-down beneath a sweeping long coat I'd never seen him wear before. No, maybe he'd been wearing it at the butcher's feast, but this was different. This was him ready to kill vampires and zombies to keep me safe. Do you think this will be dangerous?" He glanced down at the coat a bit self-consciously. "I don't think so, but it never hurts to be prepared." He smiled at me. "I'm very happy that you and your brother have found a place." I smiled sickly and followed him out to the car that was running in front of the steps. He followed the circular drive to the gate, which opened automatically. Then he pulled out quickly onto the deserted road. The drive was 20 minutes. I sat in the passenger's seat, clutching my phone, staring at it, trying to convince myself that Orion would be fine. "Are you all right?" my uncle asked. "What's the difference between a CM and a butcher? Have you ever had a vision?" He glanced at me, his eyes clear, focused and completely not confused. He reminded me of my father. He would explain this. Some butchers gain some attributes that make it likely that they'll transition into a CM, but it's a difficult process, in its way as hard as becoming a butcher. The attributes you must have are connection, emotion, and most of all feeling. Most butchers never develop any of those, which makes them excellent butchers but not able to understand the bigger picture and make connections between what would otherwise be simply black and white. That's what the CM does. He sees more, understands more, and relates to everyone on their level. He understands the darkness in a way a butcher never could. I nodded and swallowed thickly. So, if Orion's having visions, that means he's transitioning into a CM? Does that mean he's going to get sick, lose his hair like Sebastian? He shook his head. No, it's not a physical change but mental, emotional, psychological. His world will be turned inside out. He'll become for some time very different from the butcher you knew. I swallowed. I needed Orion unchanged, constant, my butcher. So he won't be a butcher anymore. He shook his head. He won't actually stop being a butcher, those skills are with him whatever else happens. It's just that he'll become more as well. I'm not surprised to hear this. The CM wouldn't have sent Orion on a diplomatic mission to werewolves and vampires if he wasn't capable of seeing more than the average butcher. And the butchers, Armand and Sebastian, are more energy and capacity than one CM can manage. Yes, I can see that it's time for Orion to become a CM. He'll be even better than his father. I nodded and smiled, but I couldn't say anything. How could I say anything? The CM still had his baker, Landry, but wouldn't things be different? We still hadn't figured out the whole coma biting thing, and this thing, and my dad not being my dad thing. It was too much to deal with in too short an amount of time. And if Orion's transition made him go crazy for a little while, what could I do to help? I'd have to be strong and pulled together to make up for whatever weakness he had. I took a deep breath and sat up a little bit straighter. It was going to be fine. Everything was going to be just fine. When we pulled up to Candlestick, the gates opened immediately, but I didn't feel quite like I was coming home. I shifted, unable to relax when I'd have to see Landry. Maybe there was another explanation, but of course there couldn't be, not with my eyes. I said goodbye and headed inside like I belonged there, but I didn't quite feel like it. The house was busy even at that hour, butchers whispering, buzzing as they walked with purpose down the stone halls. I tried not to make eye contact as I headed straight for the kitchen. So what? If Landry was my genetic father? It didn't change anything. I was still my dad's daughter and Orion's baker, and that meant I had to learn what a baker could do to help a transitioning CM. I walked into the kitchen and the 15 bakers gathered stopped talking as soon as I came in. I smiled at the ones who met my eyes and smiled, but Puffer wasn't there. Of course not, I'd just come from his house. I forced myself to smile at Landry and walk over to him. What's going on? He hesitated before he took my arm and drew me to the side. I didn't expect you back so early. There have been some developments. What kind of developments? He frowned fiercely. The butcher found a baker last night in Northside. Found him decomposing, another baker said helpfully, his arms crossed firmly over his chest. We've examined the body and there's no doubt but that he was killed by energy. I stared at the black-eyed baker I'd never seen before. He was a little leaner, meaner and younger than most. Probably closer to Landry's age, maybe. Even a bit younger. How could he be killed by energy? Landry cleared his throat. You know that I've told you that you can drain a vampire stopping it, but sometimes if the energy is too evil, corrupted, strong, the dark-eyed guy said, cutting off Landry. His accent was rhythmic, slurred. I've seen it before, in Europe where the really old things sleep. I swallowed hard. So sometimes taking energy will kill you? Maybe it's not such a great defense after all. Landry shrugged and pulled out a knife, pressing it into my hand. There's always the old-fashioned way. The bakers nodded and there were some hears. I stared at the knife, the handle perfectly formed to my hand. It wasn't very large but looked extremely sharp. I don't know how to use a knife. We'll have to fix that, love. Landry grinned at me and my heart twisted in my chest a little bit. Was he my dad? I needed to bake for Orion, but the kitchen felt too close, too stuffy with all the bakers, and I had to do something to stretch my body and think. When things got to be too much, too stressful, I'd either play the violin or do gymnastics. I made my excuses and went up to my room. I pulled on my leotard with a sweater and sweats over it and headed down to the gym. No one was in the enormous box of a room, ropes dangling from the ceiling for climbing, mats on the floor for wrestling. I moved the mats into a row that covered from one wall to the other. I let my subconscious process everything while my body moved. I stood at one end of the room and let everything else fall away other than my breathing. Steady in and out as I stretched. I pictured in my mind the perfect routine. The round-off, double-back handspring to back aerial. Not terribly complicated, but it would do for a warm-up. It was a pity they didn't have uneven bars in here. That was my most difficult event and therefore the best. When trying to not think, I shook my head. No thoughts allowed other than my breathing, my heart pounding, my perfect routine. I took off, flying over the stretch of mats before I dove into the round-off, my arms strong, the impact and recoil perfect. I knew that it would be a perfect routine, and it was my body flowing through each movement as if I'd done this yesterday. I landed after the final back aerial and walked to the end of the mat to turn and begin again. I did the same routine half a dozen times before I was warm and needed something more challenging. For an hour I forgot about everything besides my body, but then I was tired. My arms as rubbery as my legs. I was out of shape. I grabbed a mat and dragged it back to its place, moving slow. I needed water, needed Orion. I shook my head and went back for another mat, then stopped staring at Casper the butcher, who was carrying 3 mats on his head and looking ridiculous. He grinned and winked at me but didn't say anything as he passed me with his mutts. I went and got another one, but I dragged it and was moving even more slowly. It was lucky that Casper had come along and was bored enough to want to help. Maybe. I finished and went to my stuff, pulling on my soft pink pants and sweatshirt, cute ones that didn't make me look like my brother. Casper came over and walked with me towards the door. You're amazing, he said with another suggestive smile. Thanks. I've been practicing for a long time. He nodded and laughed like I'd said something particularly witty and brilliant. I can tell. Do you want to get out of here for a few hours? Everything's crazy right now with the dead baker and everything with the butcher. Thanks, but I've got to get back to the kitchen. He nodded but grabbed my arm, pulling me back. I understand that. You should know that Orion's not the only butcher. I looked down at his hand, then up at him. He was really good looking, but his energy was off, not solid the way Orion and even Armin's was. I do know that. If you're looking for a baker, you should look elsewhere. There are other bakers. He laughed, but instead of pulling his hand away, his fingers tightened, digging into my skin. It hurt, but I didn't think he meant to be rough. He was just strong and forgot himself. Orion never forgot to be careful with me, well, when he wasn't biting me anyway. I've never seen a baker as pretty as you or as talented. You're 1 in a million, Violetta. You can call me Miss Tansetta, I said, my voice hard. And you can take your hand off me. He frowned and would have said something, but a figure stepped into the room, wearing a long cloak, hair loose around his face, soft silken strands contrasting with his angular cheekbones. The lady asked you to take your hand off of her. Orion's voice was soft but, oh so deadly. Casper's hand fell from me and he took 2 steps away, staring at Orion with a strange expression, not fear exactly, more like awe and respect. Orion, you're on your feet. It's good to see you. I was just trying to entertain the baker while you were out. No need to explain, Orion said in that low voice that sent a shiver through me. I crossed my arms so I wouldn't run and throw myself at him. We had a lot of things to figure out. Orion met my eyes and my heart stopped, then restarted pounding frantically in my chest. His eyes were full of so much that I couldn't understand, but he still looked at me with the burning intensity he'd had in the kitchen before he'd bitten me. Orion, I said, feeling kind of shy when he didn't come closer but stayed near the door. Are you okay? He nodded and finally started walking towards me. Miss Tansetta, I think we've approached this the wrong way. I nodded slowly. What do you suggest we do? You bite me and then I put you in a coma. He almost smiled, but he only shook his head. He didn't say anything else until he was closer, 3 feet between us. Where he stopped like that was close enough. My skin prickled from not having him in my arms, touching him, feeling him around me. I gripped my arms and forced a bright smile. Miss Tansetta, I think that we should stop taking these pointless risks. I've allowed my feelings, my selfishness to get in the way of reason and rationality. There's no sense continuing like a couple of stupid teenagers with no grasp of consequences. I swallowed hard. Stop, you mean stop kissing? He stared at me, his eyes bright and filled with a brimming agony that didn't touch his voice. He smiled slightly. I mean stop all contact, at least until I gain more control over my instincts. I won't see you again until further notice. Until further notice? You sound like the utilities company. I guess that's right. You're going to shut off my power, leave me in the dark, but I see your point. Are you doing okay? I called this morning and Armand answered. He's a fun person to talk to. Said that you had a vision. Orion took a step away from me. It's nothing that you need to worry about. I took a step after him. I couldn't help myself. And yet I find myself worrying. Just tell me that you're fine so I can sleep tonight, not wondering if you're having some kind of mental breakdown. He frowned as if puzzled. A mental breakdown? Is that what Armand said I was having? No. I just realized that there are more important things in this world than what I want, how I feel. Violetta, I think you should take some time far away from here. You could use a vacation, I'm sure, and there are places that the darkness rarely touches. I stared at him. I should go on vacation? Well, that sounds fun. Well, it would. If it didn't sound even more like exile. Are you kicking me out of here? Are you going to make me beg Armand to let me stay with him? He exhaled a sigh. Of course not. You can do whatever you like and you are always welcome at Candlestick. I was only suggesting that you might prefer to spend time somewhere else over the holidays. I put my hands on my hips. Yeah? Would it make you uncomfortable having your ex-girlfriend around? His lips tightened. I don't think of it like that. Why not? We were together and now you're dumping me because I might put you in a coma. While your reasons are completely legitimate, this isn't the best timing. You see, I've just realized that. I bit off my words and stared at him. I'm not very good at this breaking up thing. Apparently I need more practice. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to burst into tears or punch you in the face or knife you. Landry gave me a knife. You'd think it was pretty. I ran a hand through my hair. I don't understand. I mean, I do understand because you're using logic, and I really do understand logic, but it's the first time that logic has come up in this alternate universe I fell into in September. Wow, Orion being rational instead of talking about magic muffins. Think I'm going to faint or puke. Are you all right? Maybe you need some water. I took a deep breath and stared at him. Are you serious about not wanting to see me anymore, or is it part of your mental breakdown? He spoke carefully, clearly. I'm not having a mental breakdown, I'm only experiencing clarity. I never should have drawn you into this world. You would be much happier without me, without any of this. You never asked for it, never wanted it, and now you're in danger. I stared at him. Because of the missing baker? The bakers all say that he died taking too much of the wrong kind of energy. He frowned at me. Did they? That's interesting. I wrinkled my nose. Is it? Wow, your new enlightened mindset is pretty sick. Just as well you don't want anything to do with me. I stared at him. He stared back, unmoving. I took a step closer and he stepped away. I stopped. He stopped. Was this real? I just gotten used to the idea of Orion liking me, loving me, and now this? I should go, he said. I rolled my eyes. If you don't want to see me, and since I live here, you probably should. Maybe your dad won't want me to stay here now that I'm not your special friend. You can always stay with your aunt and uncle if it gets uncomfortable here. For you. I gritted my teeth. I know that I can go there. I just got back from spending the night. I shook my head and walked past him, aware that he stepped back so I wouldn't accidentally brush against him as I headed for the door. Where are you going? He asked. None of your business, I answered. Where was I going? No idea, but at that moment it didn't really seem to matter. I was wearing jogging clothes, not really warm enough for the weather, but running seemed like a good idea. I hit an exterior door and took off my sneakers, much better than house slippers for covering distance. I ran until I couldn't run anymore and instead walked along, glancing back to see two butchers tailing me. Did Orion send them after me? Orion. Tears welled in my eyes and I took the next corner left, headed southeast towards the cemetery. It would be more rational to cry there. Took a long time to jog to the cemetery, probably 2 hours since Candlestick was nowhere near it and I was moving really slow. I walked up the gravel road between rows of headstones towards the corner where my parents were laid. My mother. Why hadn't she told me that Landry was my father, that he was the best baker in the world, that I would have these talents, these abilities and compulsions that I needed to learn to control? She told me exactly nothing, and now that's what I had, nothing. I stood in front of her grave, then stared at my dad's, then at hers before I finally sat down, pulling my knees up and letting the tears fall. Honestly, nothing made sense if Orion didn't want me. This world, butchers, bakers, none of it meant anything without him. He was my rock, the center that kept everything orbiting instead of crashing down. Without his weight, his magnitude in my life, I would be nothing but a falling star or a rock. Whatever. I sat there shivering, crying, feeling like everything was so much more than wrong when someone came and stood beside me. I knew by the scuffed boots that it was not Orion. I knew by the energy I could feel even at that distance who it was before he opened his mouth. Vanilla, you're going to get a cold, and then Landry will make you drink bland soup and vile concoctions to teach you to stay healthy next time. He sighed and dropped a heavy coat over my shoulders, warm from him. Put my arms in the sleeves and wrapped it around me, not worrying about the dirt. Armand never worried about dirt that I could tell. Thanks. You've been here for hours. Your guard detail is getting bored and hungry. I shrugged. I didn't ask them to come. No? I'll have them go then. They can come back after they've eaten. He turned and motioned to the other butchers before turning back to me. Should we raise a tent here so that you can spend the rest of your days in communion with the dead? Or shall we go somewhere a little bit warmer? I looked up at him. Orion doesn't want to see me anymore. He cursed low and slow but didn't look surprised. Well, that explains why. You want to catch a pneumonia. That'll make him feel bad. I made a face at him. I'm not here to make him feel bad. I'm here because I feel bad. I feel terrible. I found out today that my dad isn't really my dad. He blinked at me. Yeah? The eyes were kind of a dead giveaway. I scowled at him. You knew? This whole time you knew and didn't say anything. I hit his shin, which hurt a lot. I pulled my throbbing hand against my chest and stared at the cold gray stone. I never doubted that my dad was my dad. He was always there for me, while I never heard mention of Landry my whole life. If he was important to my mother, you'd think she would have said something. He sat down like that was an invitation. It wasn't. Look, Vanilla, Landry's a good baker, a great baker, but he's not the kind of person I'd marry. Your dad was. Your mother picked the guy who would be a better father and who she probably liked better, even if he wasn't the one who actually did the impregnating. She chose him, he chose you, and you're glad he was your dad. Right. But Landry doesn't treat me like some random girl. He's always been extra nice to me, and when I think of him letting me suck out Orion's life because he was more concerned about me than him, I feel sick. But if he does care, why didn't he ever see me or try to connect before now? Why didn't he say anything when he met me? Armand shrugged. the movement brushing against me and giving me a little bit of energy. I needed energy so much. Orion, not this idiot. All the same, I leaned my head on his shoulder so my forehead touched his neck. The steady flow of energy began immediately, filling me with his strength plus a few odd bursts that I tried to ignore. He doesn't want to scare you away. You're kind of delicate, you know? They're a bunch of monster fighting machines and you're a fluffy little cupcake that runs away and cries at the cemetery anytime something bad happens. They don't want you to run away and get gobbled up by something that relishes cupcakes. Like you. Do you have to put your cold nose on my neck? I pulled away. Sorry. I didn't ask you if I could. He shrugged. I'll let you know if it bothers me. I frowned at him. No kidding. It kind of hurts my feelings. See? You have feelings. What are those? Butchers don't even know. And you don't even know what butchers don't know, so why are you the one they sent to check on me? He studied me. You're my baker. I'm not a butcher, but somehow we connected. So I'm responsible for your well-being. I started laughing. You're responsible for my well-being? I fell on my back, laughing so hard. Oh, you're going to make me so happy. Yeah, that's going to happen. I laughed so hard my stomach hurt, but then my heart hurt and I was going to throw up or cry or something. I stared up at Armand. I could only see his profile as he stared at the gravestone. It's ridiculous, I know, Vanilla, but ridiculous or not, I need to keep you from getting ripped apart by darkness or causing self-harm when your heart breaks, that kind of thing. Did Landry send you? He shook his head. Sebastian called me. He's also responsible for you, but he still hates it when you take his energy, and he hates seeing you cry, hates seeing you hurt. And you don't mind. He shrugged. Not particularly. Pain is one of the beautiful things about being alive. I sniffed and put my head back on his shoulder, making sure I pressed my cold nose in the fold of his neck. Enjoy the pain, Armand. Enjoy the pain. He laughed. Oh, I do, Vanilla. I'll even enjoy Orion's pain a little bit.